In 1896, a Harvard archaeologist named George Pepper crawled into a sealed underground chamber inside a structure that had no door. Inside, he found 800 pieces of turquoise, thousands of shell beads, pottery so precise it looked machine-made, and the remains of people who had been placed there with a care that suggested they were not ordinary residents. The structure had been abandoned for 600 years. Nobody could explain who built it. Nobody could explain why they left. Those two questions have never been answered. If you have never heard of Chaco Canyon, what you are about to find out will change the way you think about North American history. Subscribe and stay with this. Pepper's field notes from that first season are careful, methodical documents. He was a trained observer. He catalogued what he found without embellishment. Dimensions, materials, positions of objects, condition of remains. He was not looking for a mystery. He was conducting an excavation, but the notes carry something underneath the clinical language. A quality of repeated hesitation. Phrases like "of unusual character" and "unlike anything previously documented in this region." He was a man trying to fit what he was seeing into a framework that was not built to hold it. The chamber he entered was sealed. Not collapsed, not fallen into disuse, deliberately blocked. The wall that closed it was built after the room was complete, after the objects were placed, after the dead were laid in position. Someone built a wall to close this room from the outside and ensure that nothing inside would be easily reached. And inside that room, among the turquoise and the shell and the perfectly formed pottery, Pepper found evidence of people who were not like the others buried elsewhere at the site. Their diets were different. Their physical condition was different. They had access to materials that came from hundreds of miles away. This was not an ordinary burial. This was something set apart, deliberately, carefully, permanently set apart. The building that contained it should have been the first question. But to understand why the building is a question, you have to see it from above. Pueblo Bonito is D-shaped. From the air, the curve of its outer wall, and the flat edge of its interior courtyard produce a form that looks less like something that grew, and more like something that was drawn. 650 rooms, 40 underground ceremonial chambers called kivas, walls that rise 4 stories in some sections, and the walls themselves, constructed using a technique called core and veneer, an inner core of rubble packed between precisely shaped outer stones, achieving tolerances in fit and alignment that modern structural engineers, when they have examined them, have described as remarkable for any period of construction. No metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals. The stones were shaped by hand using harder stones as tools, a process so labor-intensive that the construction of Pueblo Bonito alone, at conservative estimates, represents millions of person-hours of coordinated work. And it was built to a plan. Not assembled piece by piece over generations in the way that most ancient settlements grow. A room added here when the population increases, a wall extended there when resources allow. Pueblo Bonito shows evidence of having been conceived in its entirety before the first stone was laid. The great D-shape, the arrangement of rooms relative to the kivas, the orientation of the structure relative to the sun, all of it coheres in a way that requires the endpoint to have been known at the beginning. But here is the detail that archaeology has never fully resolved. Pueblo Bonito could house, by the most generous estimates of room function and population density, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people. The evidence for how many people actually lived there, based on hearths, on refuse deposits, on the density of everyday domestic debris, suggests the number was considerably lower. The building was not full. It was never full, as far as the evidence shows. If it was not primarily a residence, what was it? Leave Pueblo Bonito and walk north across the canyon floor. At some point, you will encounter a road, not a path. Not a worn track created by repeated foot traffic following the easiest line through the terrain. A road, 30 feet wide, bordered in some sections by low curbed edges, elevated in some sections above the surrounding surface, cut straight through the landscape regardless of what the landscape does. If a hill is in the way, the road goes through the hill. If a cliff is in the way, stairs are cut into the cliff face. The road does not deviate. Aerial photography first revealed the full extent of the Chacoan road system in the 20th century. LiDAR surveys confirmed and extended the picture. The total documented road network covers over 400 miles and connects Chaco Canyon to approximately 150 outlier sites distributed across the surrounding region. And here is the problem that every researcher who has seriously studied the roads has eventually confronted. Most of the roads do not go to anywhere that justifies their construction. A 30-foot wide precision road requires enormous labor investment. In any civilization that builds roads for practical purposes, moving goods, moving armies, connecting markets, you build roads to places that justify the investment. You build them to population centers, to resource sites, to defensible positions. The Chacoan roads lead to locations where archaeology has found almost nothing. Small outlier structures, empty terrain, endpoints that show no evidence of having been significant destinations. The roads exist. The labor to build them was real and was spent. And the destinations do not explain why, in 1977, a woman named Anna Sofer was recording rock art on Fajardo Butte, a mesa at the entrance to Chaco Canyon, when she noticed something. 3 large stone slabs leaned against a cliff face, positioned in a way that did not look accidental. She returned on the summer solstice and watched what happened when the sun moved across the slabs. A dagger of light, narrow and precise, passed through the gap between the stones and moved slowly across the cliff face behind them. At exactly solar noon on the summer solstice, the dagger bisected a spiral petroglyph carved into the rock. Precisely, not approximately, not close. The light hit the center of the spiral at the moment of the solstice and held there. Someone had built a solar calendar into a cliff face, an instrument precise enough that it still functioned accurately after 900 years of minor rock movement and settlement. Sofra and her colleagues spent the following years examining the broader site and found something larger. Pueblo Bonito and the other great houses of Chaco Canyon are not randomly positioned. They are oriented. The walls of Pueblo Bonito mark the cardinal directions. Specific doorways align to the rising and setting positions of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, and certain alignments in the broader site correspond to the 6-year lunar standstill, the slow oscillation of the moon's rising and setting positions across its full cycle, 18.6 years. The length of one complete lunar standstill cycle. To build architecture aligned to that cycle, you must first observe the cycle through at least one complete rotation. You must record your observations in a form that survives across nearly 2 decades, and then you must use those records to plan buildings that will mark the cycle's extremes accurately. That is not a community project. That is an institution. An institution with records, with continuity across generations, with the authority to direct construction according to what the records show. What kind of society maintains that institution? The turquoise in Pepper's sealed chamber came from mines in what is now New Mexico and Nevada. The shells came from the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast. The macaws, large, brilliantly colored birds whose remains have been found at Chaco in significant numbers, came from Mesoamerica, from breeding populations that were maintained in captivity and traded northward. And in 2009, chemical residue analysis of ceramic vessels recovered from Chaco Canyon confirmed the presence of cacao, chocolate, a substance that grows in tropical regions far to the south, that was used ceremonially by Mesoamerican civilizations, that does not belong in a high desert canyon, in what is now New Mexico, by any straightforward account of pre-Columbian North America. But it was there. The chemistry is unambiguous. The timber used as ceiling beams in the great houses, massive logs, some of them over 5 meters long, came from mountain forests 60 to 100 miles away. There are no trees of that size within the canyon itself. Every beam was cut, transported across broken desert terrain, and lifted into position without wheels, without draft animals, and without any of the mechanical advantages that the civilizations we usually credit with this kind of construction relied upon. The official model describes Chaco as a regional center, a place where surrounding communities brought surplus goods for redistribution, a ceremonial hub. But the isotopic analysis of human remains at Chaco tells a different story. The high-status individuals, the ones buried in the sealed chambers, the ones with access to turquoise and macaw feathers and cacao, showed dietary signatures indicating they ate food grown far from Chaco. They were not local. If they were local, they were eating resources imported from distant places, while the lower status individuals around them subsisted on what the local environment could provide. This is not a redistribution center. The pattern of material wealth and dietary privilege at Chaco resembles something closer to a court. A place where a small number of people with access to continental trade networks lived at the center of a system that the surrounding population maintained. The outlier great houses number at least 150. They are spread across 60,000 square miles of the American Southwest, from southern Colorado to southern New Mexico, from eastern Arizona to the western edge of what is now Texas. Each one built in the Chacoan style, each one oriented according to the same astronomical principles, each one connected to the canyon by the road system or by documented sight lines along which signal fires could communicate in hours across distances that would take days to travel. This is not a regional settlement pattern. This is a network, and networks have nodes. They have centers and peripheries. They have something that organizes the periphery relative to the center. Chaco Canyon was that center. Not because it had the largest population, it probably did not. Not because it had the most agricultural land, it had very little. But because it held the institution that organized the network, the astronomical records, the ritual calendar, the relationships with the distant trading partners who supplied the cacao and the macaws and the copper bells. For 2 centuries, from approximately 900 to 1150 CE, something was organized from Chaco Canyon across 60,000 square miles of the American Southwest. 150 great houses, all built to the same plan, hundreds of miles of roads, all maintained, a continental trade network, all coordinated. And then it stopped. The drought records preserved in tree rings tell part of the story. Beginning around 1130 CE, a sustained drought settled over the Colorado Plateau. The rains that fed the small fields around Chaco's outlier communities became unreliable. The population that the network had supported began to disperse. But drought does not explain the deliberateness of what happened to Chaco Canyon itself. The rooms were sealed, not abandoned. Sealed doorways were filled with masonry. Specific chambers were closed in ways that required labor and planning. The high-status burial chamber that Pepper found in 1896 had been blocked from outside after the last interments were placed. Someone came to Chaco Canyon at the end and closed it. Not fled, closed. The institution that had organized the network for 2 centuries organized its own ending with the same deliberateness it had brought to its beginning. And then it moved. The descendants of whoever built Chaco Canyon are not unknown. They are the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. The Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the communities along the Rio Grande. They carry oral traditions that refer to Chaco, that remember it as a place of power and ceremony, that describe its ending in terms that archaeology has only partially confirmed and has never fully integrated. The academic record has spent more than a century excavating what Chaco left in the ground. It has spent considerably less time listening to what the people who came from Chaco have been saying about it. George Pepper sealed his field notes and shipped the contents of the burial chamber to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where much of it remains today. He never fully explained what he thought he had found. His published reports are careful, descriptive, restrained. The hesitation in the field notes, the sense of a framework straining against evidence it was not designed to hold, does not appear in the final published version. What he found was 8,000 pieces of turquoise in a sealed room in a building that could house 1,000 people, but probably housed far fewer, in a canyon connected to 150 outlier sites by 400 miles of impossible roads, at the center of a network that stretched across 60,000 square miles and maintained relationships with civilizations 1,000 miles to the south. Built to track astronomical cycles that require 20 years of observation to confirm, closed deliberately by people who understood what they were closing. The canyon is still there. The roads are still visible from the air. The sealed rooms still hold whatever Pepper's excavation left behind. And the question he could not answer in 1896 is the same question the evidence is still asking. Who built this? What were they doing? And what do their descendants remember that the archaeology has not yet found the framework to hear? if Chaco changed something in the way you see this continent's history. Share this. The story gets larger the further back you look.